BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNid88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And welcome to BBOR, the home of true crime talk radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DeHaan, and I am your host, as well as the creator of Astro Psych 400 here on YouTube, and regular contributor to the Zodiac Killer channel. And a great way to support these shows is just by listening to some more content. But you can also go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse, written by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel, murder mystery, inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is indeed fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the TeeSpring page. Feel free to check out some of the merchandise. And remember, being weird is not a crime. Let the show begin.
Alright, hello everybody. Today is Monday. Another Zodiac Monday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? I hope everyone had a good weekend. Just a couple of quick announcements and reminders before we truly begin. The first is, I would like to apologize that there was not a regular episode about Jean-Benet Ramsey for the weekend segment, but that was only for one weekend, and I'm hoping that that segment is going to be going out regularly in the near future. But apologies all the same, and please look forward to the new series on Jack the Ripper that will be coming out every Wednesday here on BlackBoxOnlineRadio. I've already done segments on the Jack the Ripper suspects, Aaron Kosminski, as well as Charles Lechmere, and there are many more to explore, and you can always visit some of the older episodes covering the letters that were written in the Jack the Ripper case, the From Hell letter, the Saucy Jackie postcard, and the Dear Boss letter. I stated those in reverse chronological order because I decided to make episodes last year on the channel about them in reverse chronological order, and they're even assembled here into a playlist on Black Box Online Radio. And as always, I invite you to like and subscribe. If you know anyone who is a fan of true crime cases and unsolved mysteries, they are welcome to follow the channel as well. You can share on social media. And a great way to support all of these efforts is to go over to BuyMeACoffee.com. There's a link to that in the description box. BuyMeACoffee.com allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. So, I would like to begin with something about the Zodiac Killer in regards to the Zodiac Ciphers, because the Zodiac wasn't only a serial killer who committed a crime spree in 1968-69. During this crime spree, we saw the emergence of the Zodiac's first ciphers, and those would be the 408 cipher and the 340 cipher. These all get their names because of the number of symbols in them. The 408 was solved relatively easy by Don Hardin and Betty Hardin, his wife, and Don Hardin actually goes on to become a Zodiac killer suspect. Then there was the 340 cipher that was mailed after the murder of Paul Stein, the Zodiac's final confirmed victim. And the Zodiac would go on to mail two more ciphers which have been accepted as either authentic or directly from the killer, or have a genuine connection to the Zodiac Killer mystery, and those would be the Z13 and the Z32 cipher. Now, these two have not been decoded to this day, and from talking about the Zodiac Killer with you guys here on Black Box Online Radio, I think we've all come to the consensus that it is more difficult to solve a cipher with fewer symbols. For example, with the Z32, there are only 3 symbols that repeat: the letter C, the letter O, and a triangle. Now, this triangle could be a delta sign, but with 32 symbols and only 3 of them are used twice, the overall generally accepted opinion is that there are so many possibilities that you would need the key, or you would need additional information to actually get a definitive solution to the Z32. But right now, I would like to talk about the Z13 cipher, the third one that was mailed. It has 13 symbols in it, and it goes AEN, Zodiac symbol, 8, K8, M8. And then there is some type of odd symbol that doesn't appear to be an English letter, although it could be. And then there are 3 letters at the end, N, A, and M. So, I watch a lot of videos about the Zodiac Killer on YouTube. From time to time, I just find myself on any channel under the sun or in the darkness talking about the Zodiac, so I get recommendations and I find different pathways to other corners of YouTube talking about the Zodiac, and I actually happened to find a video from Wildfire99, giving a shout out to Wildfire, who has been a longtime follower of this program and went on to release several Zodiac videos himself, and a lot of them are done in the podcast recording format. And Wildfire99 is someone who believes that Robert Ivan Nichols was the Zodiac Killer, and I've been very critical of Wildfire's observations about the Zodiac case, but in the video on the Z13, I thought that there was a somewhat reasonable attempt at solving it, and now I would love to know Wildfire's response to my assessment of the video, but it was more or less that the solution to the Z13 cipher is that the Zodiac Killer is using English letters and they are disguised. That there are letters that have some type of inversion or modification and they have something that's trying to confuse the reader. For example, there are these 3 O's that have 8s in the middle, and what Wildfire was proposing is the circles with the 8s in them are actually just the letter O, and the 8 is like a distraction. And there's some evidence for this, that Michael Cole, author of the Zodiac Killer trilogy, I shouldn't have said that, the Zodiac Revisited trilogy, the Zodiac Revisited Volumes 1, 2, and 3, has proposed that the Zodiac Killer did not use the symbol with the 8 regularly. Some of the other symbols, particularly the English letters, are used in other ciphers, but the circled 8s were primarily only used for the Z13 cipher. So, these could be English letters that are hiding in plain sight, and you just have to remove the additional piece of the distraction, and then you get the English letter. And as for that thing that I said is the symbol in the middle that we're not quite sure whether or not that's an English letter, well, it has one line going up and almost like either 2 small lines or 2 curves going on the bottom. And what Wildfire proposed is that's actually an upside down capital letter T. A capital letter T, right? But the first letters are A, E, and N. And then there's the Zodiac symbol. But the Zodiac symbol has a circle with a cross going through it. And the cross, it looks like a lowercase t. And then this is going to be some unscrambling. The A is an A, the E is an E, the N is an N, and the M is an M. Now, one letter that does need to be actually modified would be the letter K, and that the letter K has a very similar structure to the letter Y, and you need to remove one of the arms or legs of the letter K, and that becomes a Y. Now that we have the English letters identified, they are scrambled. And if you unscramble them, capital T, O, O, what do you get? 2. Well, the Zodiac Killer is saying that his name is in the cipher. My name is too many to name. And as I said before, I've been critical of Wildfire's observations, and I'm not endorsing this solution to the Z13 cipher. However, I thought that it was a fairly interesting what my name is too many to name. And then Wildfire went on to say that, well, his suspect, Robert Ivan Nichols, used multiple aliases throughout his life, most famously Joseph Newton Chandler. Robert Ivan Nichols was the man who claimed the identity of a boy who died in a traffic accident and spent years living under that name, Joseph Newton Chandler. And in fact, Robert Ivan Nichols was the first person identified via the DNA Doe project. So that goes to show that forensic science is making an enormous amount of improvements and grounds. DNA is going to be revolutionizing all types of true crime cases. And one day, I hope there is some type of DNA breakthrough in the Zodiac killer case. Recently on the channel, I read off a comment from Wildfire99 that I wasn't the biggest fan of, or I don't think in the exact same way. And here's a different one that was from last week's Zodiac Killer News Report. Ned, here's an interesting fact. Ivan is the name of a character from the novel In the Most Dangerous Game, the Mikado created by Gilbert and Sullivan. Sullivan has Ivan in it. I mean, the last 4 letters of Sullivan are IVAN, and Ivan is also found there. Also, Gilbert sounds just like Robert and a rhyme, meaning that Gilbert ends in B-E-R-T, and his suspect, Robert Ivan Nichols, had a name that also ended in B-E-R-T. Last but not least, the very first victim of Jack the Ripper was Mary Ann Nichols, who was also known as Polly Nichols, and she shared the last name with Robert Ivan Nichols, who I believe is the Zodiac Killer. The Zodiac Killer killed a man named Robert Domingos, as well as the cab driver Joseph Roy Davis, but both names coincide with the Zodiac Killer's real name and alias, Robert Ivan Nichols Joseph Newton Chandler. Joseph Newton Chandler was the boy whom I said Robert Ivan Nichols took the name of following Chandler's death. I mean, it was well after Chandler's death. And Joseph Newton Chandler, I believe, was only 8 years old when he died. All three, The Most Dangerous Game, The Mikado, and Jack the Ripper, were believed to be inspirations for the Zodiac Killer's crimes. Okay, firstly, I absolutely believe that the Zodiac Killer was inspired by Jack the Ripper, The Mikado by Gilbert and Sullivan, and The Most Dangerous Game. The references to the Mikado are very blatant, they're very obvious, and they are very apparent. The Zodiac Killer was a serial killer who also functioned in a way that is very similar to Jack the Ripper. I've talked about it so many times, and I'll even share some more later on in this episode. But the point here that I think I disagree with is that there is a clue that has been left behind about how the name Sullivan, because the Mikado's from Gilbert and Sullivan, that the IVAN was the Zodiac, leaving a clue to his identity by quoting the Mikado. That means that the Zodiac was Robert Ivan Nichols, and he was trying to clue people in to his identity, and also that Robert ends in B-E-R-T, and that Gilbert ends in B-E-R-T as well. You have Bert and Ivan there. I mean, I just don't believe that the Zodiac Killer was trying to leave clues in that particular way, with that specific level of detail. And to be very blunt and be very honest, I think that that's a little bit of either rearranging letters to get a desired result or underlining certain letters to get a desired result. But I do find that Wildfire's attempted solution to the Z13 was more compelling than I expected, so credit there. Now, speaking of comments that came in from you guys here on BlackBoxOnlineRadio, I had an episode that I made last year called The Zodiac Killer BTK Connection Debunked. Dennis Rader was the serial killer BTK, which stands for Bind, Torture, and Kill, and he is also a Zodiac Killer suspect. And I've only truly done one episode about the Zodiac Killer BTK connection, and that was the debunking episode. But I stated some reasons why I thought that BTK was not the Zodiac Killer, and yes, he was alive at the same time, yes, he was of age at the same time, but the biggest reasons why I said that I thought that Dennis Rader was not the Zodiac was because he was out of the country for the entirety of Zodiac activity, stationed at Kadena Air Base in Japan from January of 1968 to the summer of 1968, then stationed at Tachikawa Air Force Base in Japan from the summer of 68 all the way to 1970, and he is not in the Bay Area for the entirety of the confirmed Zodiac crimes, which occurred from December 20th of 1968 to October 11th of 1969. Someone who would like to challenge that would be Cyan Augustus, who wrote into the channel saying, I have a feeling that BTK was in fact the Zodiac killer, so much in the way of similarity. Too much to note without writing an essay. However, I would suggest that there are more similarities than differences. Yes, the timeline of Zodiac killings may play a part in the dispelling. It could be that it was a younger, less experienced BTK. One thing which is very large in favor of them being the same killer to me is that the Zodiac completely stopped killing, and then a year or so after BTK kills for the first time. The Zodiac was never caught because the Zodiac killer stopped killing in that area with that MO and became BTK. The victims of BTK were not sexually assaulted per se. Well, I'll just say some things later on. The physical appearance of Raider and the artist's impression of the Zodiac sketch is very striking. I think you've almost romanticized the Zodiac killer as somehow superior to BTK morally, almost mystifying him. What I see is that the Zodiac has all the hallmarks of BTK, but less developed, less bold, and incomplete. They both said the exact same thing to their victims, and both were described as nervous and shaky. Both wrote in ciphers, both used code and played games, both loved libraries, both used folk story and poetry as for the basis for their taunts. They share a striking resemblance, and both used an almost hieroglyphic signature. There are more similarities than differences here that you seem to be allowing yourself to see out of, and to be a sense of awe and admiration for the Zodiac. There's so many ways that I could respond to that particular comment. However, firstly, let's look at some of the evidence in favor of BTK being the Zodiac killer. The Zodiac did bind two of the victims, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, at the Lake Berryessa stabbing on September 27th of 1969. The Zodiac killer was a rather infrequent serial killer. BTK murdered 10 people over roughly 30 years, and the Zodiac killer murdered people not like every weekend or something like that. So, that can somewhat come together. Particularly the Lake Berryessa stabbing, though, is what I think most people zone in on with the Zodiac killer BTK connection. But there actually was a comment left by Tom Voigt of ZodiacKiller.com on that same episode, the Zodiac Killer BTK connection debunked, which said that to obtain handwriting samples from Dennis Rader, Tom Voigt's wife actually wrote a letter to Dennis Rader to try and get a response, and they did, and his handwriting was completely different, and a Wichita news station even did a news story about that, and his wife was referred to by the name Mabel. So, different handwriting, that's another strike against, and as you can tell, I'm really trying to get to the points where I want to challenge this particular person's comment because I genuinely disagree with it, and no disrespect to Cyan, however, how is it appropriate to say that both BTK and the Zodiac loved libraries? The Zodiac killer has not been identified. When did the Zodiac say in letters, I like libraries? Where are you getting that from? But there's something that I've wanted to discuss with you guys on the channel for quite some time now. I've contemplated doing an Anything Goes segment about BTK's first crime, the Otero murders. And that's what I would like to do right now. And think of this as a case study or a discussion comparing the Otero murders to the crimes of the Zodiac killer. And I'm going to go over to an article from ABC News that was written by Sean Dooley, Jennifer Smith, and Alexa Valiente, just citing the source one more time, abcnews.go.com. Charlie Otero was 15 years old the day his parents and two siblings were murdered by the notorious BTK serial killer. And yes, that's right, BTK started out with a quadruple homicide. It was just like if you ripped my chest open and tore my heart out. For more than 30 years, the BTK killer haunted Wichita, Kansas, torturing and murdering 10 people. He was known for taunting local media with police letters and phone calls, and seeking recognition and detailing his horrific crimes. Well, Cyan Augustus, I'll give you credit there, that does sound like the Zodiac. We really could just insert the Zodiac's name into that. The abbreviation BTK stands for Bind, Torture, Kill, a moniker the killer had given himself that indicated what he had done to his victims. And yes, this is a big similarity between BTK and the Zodiac. Both of them gave themselves their own nickname, and longtime Black Box Online Radio listeners will remember an episode that I did back in 2020 where I played a segment from the podcast The First Degree where I was talking about how I mean, it's not even me specifically. One of the hosts of The First Degree said, "There's a special place in hell for a serial killer who gives himself his own nickname, because then it's just about trying to be one of them. It's just about trying to become one of the other serial killers that have made their way into the world of media, and this person had a particular form of desire." And I think that an exception to that might be Jack the Ripper, because Jack the Ripper may have been the origin for these types of serial killers. And continuing onward with the article, in 2005, the authorities were able to identify BTK as Dennis Rader, a married father of two who was president of his church, a Boy Scout troop leader, and an Air Force veteran. Rader, now 73, is currently serving 10 life sentences without the possibility of parole after pleading guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder in 2005. And yes, BTK's confession was recorded, and I did a full response to the confession here on Black Box Online Radio, which anybody can listen to. Rader's killing spree began in January of 1974 when he targeted the Otero family, who had been living in Wichita for less than 6 months. Julie and Joseph Otero had 5 children, and their older children had gone to school that day, leaving the 2 younger children, 9-year-old Joey and 11-year-old Josie, at home with their parents. "My father was really outgoing, a jovial kind of guy," Charlie Otero said, "and my mother a very caring and loving Catholic woman. She was a mother first, you know." The son of the BTK murder victims talked about how he moved on from the tragedy. Charlie Otero was 15 years old when his parents and 2 siblings were murdered by BTK. Otero today now shares how he overcame feelings of revenge and his message of redemption with ABCnews.com. When Charlie Otero and his siblings came home from school, they found their dog Lucky was outside, and they never had to say what happened. "I went to the back door of the kitchen entrance and opened it up and walked inside. I looked at the stove, and my mom's purse was on the stove, and it was flipped up, disheveled, and stuff was thrown everywhere. That wasn't typical of my mother at all. She was a very tidy person, and the kitchen never looked like that, so I yelled out, 'Is anybody home?'" Charlie recalled. Charlie Otero says his siblings then yelled to him, "Charlie, come quick. Mom and Dad are playing a bad trick on us." I ran down the hall and went into their bedroom and saw my mother on the bed, my father on the floor, and my heart just got ripped out of my chest. "My life changed instantly," Charlie Otero said. "When I looked at my mother, she was tied up. It didn't even look like my mother. My dad had a belt wrapped around his neck. They had called the police from a neighbor's house, and when police arrived, they discovered the bodies of 11-year-old Josie in the basement and 9-year-old Joey in another room." Charlie Otero said that he didn't know his younger brother and sister had also been killed until a chaplain and police officer had told him about that in the station. Okay, so some immediate differences between BTK and the Zodiac. BTK targeted people inside their homes, a home invader. And you also heard very clearly that 2 children were murdered, the youngest victim being 9 years old. The Zodiac Killer didn't target victims that young. The Zodiac Killer's youngest victim was actually Betty Lou Jensen, who was murdered at the Lake Herman Road murders on December 20th of 1968. And this is very important for psychopathology as well as behavioral profiling, looking at whether or not a serial killer targets teenagers versus killing children. And I can comprehend this narrative. I can comprehend this idea that people have about the Zodiac Killer BTK connection, where they're thinking that the Zodiac was a younger, less experienced BTK, and that he went on to become more vicious and more sadistic as time went by, as well as more intricate and approaching different locations, because, as previously stated, the Zodiac Killer didn't murder anyone inside their home. The Zodiac murdered his victims outside, all of them, And it's arguable that the murder of Paul Stein committed outside the final Zodiac killer victim, because Paul Stein was a taxi driver, and he was murdered inside his taxi cab. However, the Zodiac was not a home invader. That's point number one. And also, there is this element of ransacking that is going on. Charlie Otero's talking about how he comes home and his mother's purse has been turned about and everything's thrown about in the house. That sounds more like the Golden State Killer rather than BTK. But of course, the Golden State Killer has been identified as Joseph D'Angelo. I don't think there's any type of connection. I mean, I told you guys very clearly what I think. I think BTK was out of the country during the time of the Zodiac murders. But let's look at another part of that comment from Cyan Augustus, saying that I'm glorifying or mystifying the Zodiac. Both the Zodiac Killer and BTK were wrong. Both of them did terrible things. Both of them did disgusting things. And the more I talk about this with you guys here on Black Box Online Radio, the more I just have this overwhelming reaction that serial killers are bad. And we talk about these things because they are bad and we want to keep them out of our normal lives. And the Zodiac was not only a serial killer, he was also a coward, a weakling. He only targeted people who were defenseless and couldn't fight back. The Zodiac was probably someone who would sneak up on teenagers in the dark, fire gunshots, and run away. The Zodiac was a loser and most likely a reject. So there's absolutely nothing glorifying or mystifying the Zodiac. I mean, he was a very weak person who took advantage of certain circumstances to murder people. And with BTK, it's very similar. It's very similar, except for the fact that BTK added an element of sadism into his crimes, and also, I mean, you just heard that description of the Otero family murders. Definitely a more vicious serial killer. And when you watch Dennis Rader's confession, which is available here on YouTube, and as I said, you can listen to my response to that as well, he is just sharing a story that he wanted to tell for a very long time. You can tell that he has probably thought about the crimes a lot, enjoyed them a lot, remembered the details very clearly, and he wanted to talk to people about his vicious criminal exploits. And Dennis Rader is a terrible person, and he is a very, very demented individual. But there was a comment that came in on one of the episodes I did about BTK from Albert Forel, who said that he had trouble believing that the Otero family murders were the first crimes committed by BTK. That I can agree with. I mean, someone commits his first murder, and it's a quadruple homicide where two children are murdered, and I also can comprehend that. And let's not kid ourselves. I get this narrative. I get this narrative about how the Zodiac is very basic and BTK is more complex. The Zodiac is, as I said, the scared younger man targeting teenagers, composing very basic ciphers, writing letters that just have ideas from movies and books and such, as previously stated, The Most Dangerous Game, that short story, as well as perhaps the film version of it, and some other things the Zodiac could have read, The Secret Agent by Joseph Conrad, as well as perhaps the Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. There are so many pieces of literature that could have inspired the Zodiac, as well as nonfiction, such as The American Practical Navigator, a book on nautical navigation and celestial navigation, and it's a lot about using compasses and directions, as well as radians. So there are lots of clues as to how the Zodiac was operating, and if BTK hadn't been in Japan, I think that you could have a reasonable discussion on that, but firstly, out of the country, and even still, what about all of these differences? I mean, what about all of these assumptions that people are making? Well, they both like libraries. Yeah, I don't know about that, sir. And if anybody is curious, there is a documentary called I Survived BTK. BTK and the Otero Family Murders I absolutely hope to watch this at some point. And there are several books about BTK that have been put out, such as The Hunt for the BTK Killer. And I think that there's just going to be some things that are going to be added to my reading list. And a particular comment came in on the Anything Goes Friday segment, which was not about BTK, but about the Long Island serial killer. And I was talking about the book Jimmy the King, which is talking about a Long Island serial killer suspect named Jimmy Burke, but also looking at some of the corruption in the Suffolk County Police Department in New York. And somebody said, why don't you read the book, not just post the cover? And my simple response to that, okay, it's actually a complicated response, but there's a great scene in the movie The Emperor's Club with Kevin Kline, and he's talking to Emile Hirsch. And Kevin Kline says, you know what they say about Rome? And Emile Hirsch says, it wasn't built in a day? And Kevin Kline says, no, all roads lead to it. And, I mean, you don't just simply read a book and talk about it for 5 minutes. Some people on YouTube will do that. They'll read a book and talk about it for 5 minutes. As you guys know, if I'm reading a book, I'm talking to you guys about chapter 1, then the episode 2 is about chapter 2, and it goes on and on and on. It takes time to go through all of these pieces of true crime material. And a perfect example of this is that I've been reading the book Jack the Ripper and the Zodiac Killer by Zed Simpson. It's from the Charles River Editors series, and I would like to share something from that book with you. Now, going into this, I had heard that there were a lot of very critical things that people had to say about the Charles River Editors books, and that they didn't do the most thorough research. Okay, I'm going to be a little bit more honest than that. I read one review online when somebody said that these are just paraphrasing Wikipedia articles. I don't know exactly if that's what Zed Simpson's book is doing. That's what someone else said online. I might not even agree with that. But my biggest complaint about this book, Jack the Ripper and the Zodiac by Zed Simpson, is there aren't a lot of strong transitions between the stuff on Jack the Ripper and the Zodiac. It's talking about Jack the Ripper, and then it's talking about the Zodiac, and it's just going from one idea to the next, and not really exploring the particular connections as to how Jack the Ripper could have inspired the Zodiac Killer, because you guys know, and I've stated this very clearly, in every fiber of my being, I believe that Jack the Ripper was an inspiration for the Zodiac. And hopefully I'll be doing more about that on the Wednesday segment. As I said, every Wednesday I will be talking about Jack the Ripper now for the foreseeable future. But here's something else that I would like to share with you, and that is that if you do want to read the book, overwhelmingly, it's more about Jack the Ripper. You Ripperologists out there will probably have somewhat of a good time with this. Lots about the Ripper, very little about the Zodiac. But there is something in Zed Simpson's book about the Zodiac Killer that I would like to read to you, and I want to know what you guys think about this. I want to know your responses. And that is that this is a profile of who the Zodiac Killer could have been. And let's have a read here. An inconspicuous man. Somewhere in the shady hill country around Napa and Vallejo, 25 miles north of San Francisco, lives an inconspicuous man. He has a fantastic secret, though if only people knew, well then they wouldn't ignore him. He's fairly bright, but his spelling and grammar indicates a poor education, so he probably doesn't have a very good job. He's about 6 feet tall, 35, or perhaps younger, has wavy light brown hair, and he's fat, well over 200 pounds, so he probably doesn't do too well with girls. In fact, he has unwittingly indicated a sign of sexual inadequacy, but he would never knowingly admit it. He's very guarded about personal matters. He could be old Mrs. So-and-so's boy, who never says boo and still lives at home, or that bachelor who keeps to himself and seems to never have any fun, or that poor guy who works so hard at that lousy job and never complains, and never lets on that his marriage is miserable and that his wife is a slut. And yes, that's what it says.
and that his wife is a slut or a shrew. Oh, and he's an astrology fan. He's adopted a nickname too, the Zodiac. And when the signs are right, he goes out and finds young boys and girls together who symbolize everything that has denied him, and he kills them. And this is a quotation from Dave Smith Starr from the Los Angeles Times of October 19th, 1969, The Inconspicuous Man, and the response from Zed Simpson is here. Since he was never caught, there was no way of knowing how exactly the Zodiac committed his crimes, and how many people the Zodiac murdered. He may have killed for the first time as early as June 4th of 1963, when he or someone else gunned down teenagers Robert Domingos and Linda Edwards, and as they were enjoying a day at the beach near Lompoc, California. According to the United Press International, the authorities are investigating the mysterious gunshot and slaying of high school sweethearts Linda Edwards and Robert Domingos, who were due to graduate Thursday night. Linda was 17 and Robert was 18. And their bodies were found dead. They were clad in swimsuits Wednesday on a lonely stretch of beach near neighboring Santa Barbara. Police never identified their killer, and the case remains open and unsolved to this day. But since there were no other similar incidents in the months immediately after following the crime, it is difficult to say whether it was part of a bigger crime spree or not. Now, immediately, Zed Simpson is going to go and look at the murder of Sherry Jo Bates. And I want to talk about that LA Times quotation. However, immediately he's going to go on and say that there's the murder of Sherry Jo Bates in 1966. I mean, that's the next sentence in the book. The next murder that might have been part of the Zodiac killer's handiwork took place on October 30th of 1966, when the body of an attractive cheerleader was found on the campus of Riverside City College. I will have to dispute this particular paragraph when he says the police never identified the killer and that there were no other similar incidents in the months immediately after following the crime. Not quite, because the Domingos Edwards murders, firstly, are an unconfirmed Zodiac killer crime. And after the Domingos Edwards murders, there's another unconfirmed Zodiac crime, the Swindle murders, the murders of Johnny Ray and Joyce Swindle in February of 1964. And if you go back and read the original news coverage after the Swindle murders, there were people who believed that there was the same killer who committed the Domingos Edwards murders and committed the Swindle murders in Ocean Beach in Southern California, and as previously stated, Robert Domingos and Linda Edwards were murdered outside of Lompoc, but a place near Gaviota Beach. It's often referred to as the Gaviota shooting, but these crimes are all taking place in Southern California, right? And what they thought was that there was a sweetheart slayer on the loose, that there was indeed a serial killer who was targeting either lovers' lanes or young couples. Johnny Ray and Joyce Swindle were married at the time. They were relatively newlywed, and Robert Domingos and Linda Edwards were actually in high school on a senior skip day. So I don't accept this, that there were no other similar incidents that followed in the months immediately following. Yes, there were. But much more importantly, I would like to go to this quotation that Zed Simpson has shared from the LA Times 1969. Again, the quotation was written by Dave Smith Starr, but it says, this is the stuff that I really want to know what you guys think about. The Zodiac killer was somebody who did not have the best education. He's fairly bright, but his spelling and grammar indicate a poor education, so he probably doesn't have a very good job. About 6 feet tall, 35 years old, perhaps younger, wavy light brown hair. He's fat, well over 200 pounds, so he probably doesn't do too well with girls. In fact, he has unwittingly indicated a sexual inadequacy. I think that it's possible to say that the Zodiac killer was 6 feet tall, but mostly I say the Zodiac was somewhere between 5 feet 8 and 6 feet tall, because there are witness descriptions of the Zodiac killer being 5 feet 8 inches tall, particularly after the Blue Rock Springs shooting and the Stein murder. But let's look at the Blue Rock Springs shooting example. Mike Mageau, the surviving witness, stated that he thought the Zodiac killer was 5 feet 8 inches tall. And as far as being fat, Mike Mageau also estimated that the Zodiac was 195 or 200 pounds, beefy but not overly fat.
Now, first-hand experience here, I'm 5 feet 8 inches tall, 200 pounds. People would probably not describe me as fat, just in the gut area. Yep. So, just because someone is 200 pounds, it doesn't mean that they're going to look overly fat. Now, this thing here, though, about fairly bright but spelling and grammar indicate a poor education, I do not agree with that. I believe that the spelling and grammar issues are intentional, specifically the spelling issues. I believe that the Zodiac Killer knew how to spell these words, and that he was doing it on purpose for some unknown reason. One point could be that he was just simply imitating who? Jack the Ripper. And I wish there was more stuff about that here in this book by Zed Simpson, where he is supposedly writing a book about Jack the Ripper and the Zodiac Killer. But even the Ripper letters had misspellings. Even the unconfirmed Ripper letters, such as the Openshaw letter, had misspellings. And a lot of what the Zodiac did was recreating Jack the Ripper. Now let's look at the other part of the profile here that was created by Dave Smithstar and shared by Zed Simpson. He's very guarded about personal matters. He could be old Miss So-and-so's boy, who never says boo and still lives at home, or that bachelor who keeps to himself and never seems to have any fun, or that poor guy who works so hard at that lousy job and never complains and never lets on that his marriage is miserable. Two big ideas there. One is that the Zodiac Killer is a lonely guy who never got married, and the second one is, okay, he is married and he hates his wife. I tend to lean toward the first, but the second is possible. What do you guys think? Do you think there's anything in the Zodiac Killer's behavior that suggests that he was married? I mean, we can even go back to Gary Stewart, of all people, who stated that he thought the Zodiac Killer was married because he's the married family man, and by family man, I just mean that married and had kids. Doesn't mean he was a good person, and he just committed these crimes only when he could get away with it from his wife. And yes, Gary Stewart, author of The Most Dangerous Animal of All, is a fraud in his own right, but that's an interesting observation all the same. So, I think that I would lean toward that, but there is a reasonable case that people, such as the previously mentioned Michael Cole, make about how he doesn't think that the Zodiac was married, instead thinking that the Zodiac was a single man, antisocial, working a solitary job, maybe even a lousy solitary job, but a lot of people think this about unknown serial killers, that they're just going to be the nicest guy in the world. And from talking about lots of serial killers here on Black Box Online Radio, I think that many of them come across as mostly well-balanced individuals, as a facade, but almost always you will hear stories about them just losing it and going crazy on people. For example, the story of Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. I mean, he's described as very gentle by people, or just he doesn't have a lot to talk about. And then you hear stories of him chopping at his neighbor's home with an axe and just like freaking out and going berserk. Joseph D'Angelo, the Golden State Killer, also known to just have angry outbursts and just show signs of mental instability. Those are the things that come through. But that's just my particular take on the subject. So overall, though, I do think the age is relatively reasonable. Mid-30s or younger. Wavy brown hair, also reasonable. But as far as this whole stuff about he thinks his wife's a slut, I think that that's just shock value minus the value thrown in by Dave Smithstar. And I also do not completely agree with Zed Simpson's idea that the Robert Domingos and Linda Edwards crime were some type of isolated incident that took place near Gaviota Beach in 1963. Let alone that there was the murder of Vern Smith that took place the day before, which could also be a possible Zodiac crime, although that one was not a Lover's Lane shooting, that was a stabbing. So, lots of crimes happen in Southern California, and sometimes people try to unite them together, but one person whom I absolutely think was not the Zodiac was BTK. And lastly, I would like to conclude with the supporter shoutouts, and giving one to Batman66, And you can support the show with buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88, as well as the super thanks here on YouTube. And thank you so much to Batman66 for your continued support. And that will end things for me now. And anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio@AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. And there's always BlackBoxNid88 over on Instagram. And I will see you there for the bonus podcast. Goodbye.